Our eighth talk is titled Enhancing Connectedness in Teams During Crisis and is delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Gill Wilkinson, who is a Deputy Commander at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst.
And so what I would have been showing you next was going back to that very simple diagram which Langley showed you last week. And I'll bring it up just as a reminder. It's called Adair's leadership model, where it's got three neat circles, the task being the upper circle, the team and the individual being the others. And Langley talked last week about investing in each of those. Now, the military are very lucky because we are not always at war. We have the time to extract and to invest in the individuals and the teams. And we do that because we need to know that when the task becomes the most important thing, individuals are able to put their personal needs and their team needs to the side, literally, if necessary, stepping over a dying friend, because the task must be completed against all odds. And only when the task is complete can we go backwards and look after the individual and rebuild the team cohesion. Now, that's not something which you in the NHS would normally have the luxury of doing, because you are always at war, and the current crisis that you're in typifies that more than most. But even in normal working life, I would suggest that you're constantly fighting the battle. However, it's worth remembering that even in the Second World War, the army brought its leaders, its young leaders, back from the front line, where they were very much needed, and trained them in leadership and staff college. Even at the very worst times, they invested in leadership. The next bit that I wanted to show you was a picture, and I'll bring it up just for you to see. And it's what you will hopefully see is the top left, which looks more like a triangle, is what many people see as being a typical leader and their team. So with the leader building connections and relationships with each member of their team. And those are all strong lines and have to be strong lines. This other model, which is slightly more circular and has dotted lines, is there to represent the fact that the leader isn't only responsible for the relationship with each person in their team, but they're responsible for the relationships between the other individuals as well. And that's where cohesion and teamwork really adds to resilience. So for instance, if you're in a lucky position of being given a task where 100% is not required, where there is no correct solution, where perhaps in the clinical field, nobody's going to die if you get it wrong, then you really must invest in the leader and the individual. And that might be at cost of how well the task is carried out. And as a leader, then it's your responsibility to know your people well enough to suggest that perhaps two people who do not get on with each other, who are in conflict. We had a previous conversation on the first resilience forum that I was called into about dealing with the miscreant in your team. Dealing with those people, perhaps you can take risk on a task by sending them off to complete something together, rather than always needing the 100% solution. And so those circles in the Adair's model, whilst they're always presented, if you Google it, you'll always find that they're presented in equilibrium with a very sweet spot in the middle. But actually, at any one snapshot in time, I would suggest that they will never be in equilibrium. It's like a bank account where you draw very heavily against the task, for instance, in the example I used for warfare. You can only do that if you have invested heavily in the individual and invested heavily in the team. Likewise, you might find times where there is a period where it's all about investing in individual skills for you to pull in the right team members for a specific task. And only once that is done can you redress the balance and rebuild the team cohesion. I wanted to share another story of my experience with the NHS to kind of exemplify what I've just said. And it was when working with what was effectively a ward intervention from one of the hospital trusts in London. And my examples, of course, come from areas where people had problems. So I know that, you know, much of the NHS does not suffer to the same degree with the example I'm going to use. But the group that I was working with was a group of 9 people, all from the same ward, and included a surgeon who turned up every day in his pinstripe suit, and some junior doctors, and some very senior nurses. And most of the programme was about recognising the impact of each individual's behaviour on each other. And the surgeon was very brusque. He was probably, you know, the archetypal bad caricature of a surgeon, you know, in that he was from a very old-fashioned approach. He said, and I remember it vividly, "I really don't care what the other medical staff think of me. My patients know my record because I tell them." And only by day 3 of the course, where these people were spending 8 hours a day together, did one of the nurses say to him, every time I find out that I am working for you in theatre, I cry for an hour before I go to work, and I do not say anything. And if you were to take out the wrong bit of the body, I would be too scared to say. So that was a salutary lesson to me and to him, I think, on why cohesion and relationship with his team mattered more than perhaps his clinical skills at certain times. I was hoping to move on then to talk about another example of relationships between teams where I was really shocked. So it was a different set of people, but again, a medical team of people who usually work together. And one day, at day 4 of a course, one of the senior nurses came in, and he looked exhausted. He looked absolutely exhausted. And I just said to him, as we were sort of doing a checking in procedure at the start of the day, "Are you okay? Are you feeling okay? You don't look you know, as energetic as you have been." And he sort of was a little hesitant. And then he said, "Well, I haven't slept at all since yesterday." And I said, "Gosh, you know, do you want to share why?" And he said, "Well, actually, I've got a severely disabled son who is autistic amongst having other very severe complex needs." He says, "My wife and I work alternate shifts, day and night shifts, because he cannot be left unaccompanied. Somebody has to sleep on his bedroom floor with him. And last night, I simply got no sleep." None of that nurse's colleagues knew that that was the life that he was having to lead. And because he said, "Well, you know, I turn up for work. Work is my escape. I turn up for work. I didn't really feel it was appropriate to share my problems with the rest of the team." However, I'm sure that this audience, you're all here and you're interested in resilience. It doesn't take long to get from that point to realize that, again, nobody is at their best if they cannot share and put trust in each other to be able to admit and say, "I'm having a bad day and I need help." And so it's the leader's responsibility to take the conscious decision to set the culture to allow that trust to be built up between the team. And that's not easy. And it often requires an element of giving more trust than you might feel comfortable with early on. Now, that doesn't have to be clinical trust, but it may well be personal trust as well, disclosing your own fears and disclosing your own strengths and the areas that you have concerns about. That can backfire, there's no doubt. I'm not sort of giving some panacea that is without judgment. And there is always risk in making yourself vulnerable by sharing some of your own vulnerabilities. However, only by giving trust do we get that reciprocal trust back. And so sorry, I'll just try and reframe myself back to my slides. My point is that commitment and compassion in your relationship with your individuals and the individuals that you work with will be seen above all else. You will be watched. Your culture will be noticed. And if you create a culture which is panicking and overly austere or fits a very transactional model, which is what an awful lot of the NHS business processes have become over the last, you know better than me, 20 to 25 years, it's very, very easy for that transactional model to slip in to the workplace and to slip in to the actual relationships between people. And I would suggest that we must guard against that, because Aidan's words were that it was managing the vocation out of healthcare. So get the transactional bit done, but if people are having to clock in and clock out of work and are not given any freedom and any trust, then neither will they give any of the discretionary element that's necessary to create the cohesion around the team. And the trust is something which I think is vitally important, and it's quite ironic that the NHS is built in organisations called trusts, because in my limited experience with the NHS, I see a lack of trust to some degree, and I see that in a lack of straight talking, where rather than reach really high performance in process, it is easier to accept mistakes or easier to accept suboptimal performance than it is to risk offending somebody by challenging them on their performance. Now, that challenge does not have to be aggressive, abusive, or bullying, but only if you've established that trust in the first place can you then build a relationship where developmental advice can be given and can be received in a trusting environment. And if you think of the organizations that do that best, you know, on a sports field, you know, it seems it's totally appropriate to say, you know, why didn't you pass the ball to me? I was free, I was there, I was, you know, that was daft, we could have scored. That's a normal tone in a sports field. And you don't expect people to talk like that in normal life. But if we could just harness a little bit of that to be able to let teams reach high performance, instead of cementing mediocrity by being scared to tell people straight how things can be improved. And I know you as an organisation are people who are coming together to try and improve the NHS and healthcare for the future. And so the same message in terms of building the team is there for the whole of the organisational team too. We need to take the risk and do some straight talking if we're going to be able to raise the ultimate performance. And I was intending to finish with a quote from Aidan Halligan again, and I will share the links to much of Aidan's work subsequently. But I was going to finish with the line that leadership comes to the fore in times of turbulence and change, when people need to be shown a new way, even if their instinct is to stick with the familiarity of the old, whatever its cost. And I think that's where perhaps the greatest opportunity is now, because sticking with the old is simply not an option anymore. And so you as leaders in healthcare really do have probably a once in a lifetime opportunity to change process, to change culture, and to really drive for high performance by building on cohesion and collaboration and relationships with the people that work for you and with you. And I'll finish there, since I haven't got the backup of the IT to show you anything else.
Thank you, Gill, for your talk and for showing the resilience to get through that initial hindrance and giving us your informed wisdom. You know, I'm going to summarize some of the points you made, and then hopefully we can all have a discussion. So we heard in previous talks that setting a clear purpose and a direction is key for leadership. And what you have told us today, that often as a leader, we have to lead teams. And there are difficulties when we lead teams because many of us share different backgrounds. And so the key of a leader is to recognize we have different backgrounds, but also shift us to the belief that we have a common purpose. That's set by the leader. And you have mentioned that in many teams, that transparency and clarity of thought and word and action is not always there. And many of us watching today can imagine going back to the work environments where we are, whether it's a hospital team in my case, or a business team, or a sports team in your local area. And there'll be individuals within that team that, should we say, may resist change for whatever reason. And so the challenge is, how do we encourage people to follow that common goal? Even the story that you draw on about doctors and hospital managers maybe not always coming together, but sometimes pulling apart. It's still inherent on the leaders to set that clear common purpose of good patient care in the case of healthcare. And so I just wanted to sort of bring on the concept of story as a means to draw people together. And I do remember one of the issues in the media at the moment is the care home crisis with the COVID and all the excess deaths that are happening there. And some people believe that we're not being given transparent information, and other people think that we are. And I just remember when I was 18, so 25 years ago, when I met, I think there was a 79-year-old patient in a nursing home, and I used to work as a volunteer in a nursing home. And he told me that he was one of the World War II veterans, and he was on the beach in Dunkirk. And he told me how the waves were crashing in and the airplanes were flying over and the bombs dropping. And all the army guys were, literally petrified of what might be, because the German army were closing in. But the transparency that they got at that time was the government recognized that there was a major problem. And they knew it was not in their capability to solve the problem. So what they did was harnessed the goodwill of the British people. And he told me how he saw this flotilla of ships, just little ships, fishermen, carpenters, plumbers, manning these boats, all coming across the ocean to pick up all these army people. And it made all the individuals on that beach feel that they were pulling together for a collective purpose. And that was his story. And that was how he went ahead and thought about sort of collective power that informed his belief in the future when he was in teams. So I'm just going to show, I guess, put it out there that actually one way that you can bring people together in teams when they're pulling apart is actually to find a common story that can emotively bring people together and recognize that, although we may share different backgrounds, we do have a common purpose. And maybe that's one of the skills of leadership. And I'd be interested to hear what people think about how they dealing with people in their, should we say, work or home environments when, should we say, people are pulling in different directions to achieve a goal. Or maybe in the scenario you've given, Gill, a culture that is, should we say, negative because the information isn't necessarily always being provided transparently. So I'm going to pass on to Vivek now, who's going to tell us about next week and also moderate the discussion. So if people have a think about questions they wish to ask, we would be most grateful to hear people's views.
Thank you, Matt. Is everyone able to hear me? Thank you for the fantastic talk, Gill. Sorry about the technical glitches, but hopefully, no, that's okay. I think it still was worth it. So next week, next Wednesday, again, as usual, we have the talk planned for 6 o'clock in the evening. And for next week, we have, I'm just going to put this slide up and hopefully you can see it. Be able to see the poster for the next week here. But basically, it's Barbara Kemp from Oxford Brookes University, who's leader of the leadership module there. And she's going to talk on enhancing collaboration and handling conflict constructively in these challenging times. Obviously, it's a problem which is far bigger than for one person to cope with on their own, even though people may claim to be, but I don't think anyone is capable of handling this by oneself. So there comes in collaboration, and there are opportunities for that, but people may feel hesitant, and she's going to talk about the challenges that stop us working collaboratively. But also when we do work in a team, which may be quite new, and we have heard about on previous talks on how new teams can come together and still work effectively if you have a shared purpose, but there can still be conflicts on day-to-day basis. But that is just the nature of how things happen. It is to be seen as more in a constructive way. And the second theme of her talk is about how we handle that in a constructive way so a greater good can be achieved. So that's for 6 o'clock in the evening on May the 27th, next Wednesday. So please do join us again and do spread the topic around, and we will hope to see you again. I think we can open up here for discussions and questions. Any comments from the chat box that we have already?
We've had quite a few really interesting questions, and I wondered if Lucy wanted to pose her question to Gill. We need to unmute you, don't we? Let me try. Ali, could Lucy just private message me or just?
I can see Lucy's question.
Perfect.
Yes.
Just to read it out for everyone. She said, really great talk, thank you. I was struck by Gill's comment that unlike in the army, NHS workers are always deployed. So we don't incorporate the time for team building, which is a very good point. Any thoughts or advice on how to debrief or help our team to get over the past months? Thank you, Lucy, for that question.
So that was, I mentioned that because it struck me that, as I say, even in times of war, we did extract and bring people back for leadership training. Likewise, team building and a lot of the work that I do with the NHS, the most senior turn up and are complaining that there are training events, aren't there? They're difficult to get to. You often have to pay a lot for them. And then the whole time you're there, you're not really there. You're still half in your work because you're having to cover work at the same time. And I can't tell you how to influence the NHS to simply make that better. But what I would say is that the transactional element that I mentioned is a false economy. The fact that you will only get this trust if you've formed teams, but yet, of course, you're constantly changing teams because of resource issues. You're getting new people in to cover gaps. You don't get full-time staff because you're covering gaps, all sorts of reasons. So I'm certainly not saying it's easy. What I do think is that even within the workplace, even on day-to-day business, even on the tea breaks, investing in those little moments of building relationships are probably worth it. Well, I believe they certainly are worth it. And I also think it is worth fighting the case to have time away from the working environment for your team. I appreciate what a valuable resource you are when you're on the ward or whether you're in clinical leadership positions. But the time the time invested in building the team would, in my opinion, create better efficiencies in the long run than ignoring the requirement to do it.
Thank you.
That's not an easy answer.
No.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, thank you. I can really see that it's normally a problem for us. Like in normal times, it's a problem that we don't have the time to get outside the chaos and the stress of the work environment and deal with each other in a more social way. There's no formalized time like that. So even the training events you talked about are often not with your team. They might be with other people of your grade or specialty or whatever. But I think after this, or as we move on from this episode, I mean, how long did the army keep people deployed for before they pull them out?
The norm is 6 months. You would normally have a sort of 4 or 5 months uplift and training before you go, 6 months, and then a bit of decompression. We call it decompression at the end. They get longer leave. Now that's not always, and this might be something that is valuable for you. Bringing a soldier who's been at war, like your people, back to their families can create other issues. Now I know many of your people are still living at home whilst they're going through all of the trauma and challenges that they're in. Some aren't, some are having to distance themselves from their families. And each of those scenarios brings a challenge in itself. Their families won't know what they've been through. So perhaps when there are occasions to be able to reward, it might be worth thinking about families and bringing families in. Again, I know that's not easy in every situation. It's something that's much easier in the military, or it is in certain bits of the military. But, acknowledging the families who have lived with this, I think is important, because otherwise you'll get a sense of, there will be relationship breakdowns without a doubt for families where, the person who's been experiencing all this pain and all the trauma that they've been dealing with in their clinical role simply cannot share that with their family. So then I know that the Army's already working with the NHS to share our procedures, which we call trauma risk management. Now, it tends to be more specific incidents based, but it is about having sessions later with the people who you have gone through the trauma with, so that it is an area where you can freely say, oh, do you remember when we experienced this? The problem, of course, again, is because you will have people moving on, moving out, moving away from the people that they shared the experience with, and they will be the people who are most at risk of anxiety thereafter.
Wow, thank you very much for that. There's a question that was put forward by Sally, which I really think it's great, because the one thing you mentioned was about straight talking. But on that note, she mentioned there's a lack of trust in the NHS because people believe there's a scapegoat philosophy and believe if something goes wrong, there's an instant, scurry to find out who's to blame. This causes people to close down and work in silos. This is all associated with governance. So what are your thoughts on that?
And I think that same issue creeps into an awful lot of organisations. And I know that certainly at UCL, not the programme I was working on, there was a lot of work done on after action reviews and trying to remove any blame culture from it. But it's partly a human factor, isn't it? It's human nature. Outside of work, in any situation, it is human nature to try to find a scapegoat. And I noticed that Sally had also mentioned something else about an inspiring surgical leader who washed the floors and worked with everybody across the hierarchy. And I think there's something of an answer within that too. I think, again, it comes down to the trust that whatever you do will be received in the way that it's meant to be, in the way that it's deliberately intended to be. There's something in, if people know that your intent is good because they have respect for you, because they've already got that relationship with you, then it is easier to forgive and easier to be forgiven and feel forgiven when mistakes happen. But again, I am not at all intimating that there is an easy answer to the fact that people will look for scapegoats. It's a natural problem and it goes well beyond the NHS. It's just that when you guys get it wrong, it hits the news, doesn't it? and that makes it even harder.
Could I come in on this, please? Gill, I was really touched by the tour you gave me on the 11th of March, luckily a week before the lockdown, at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And in our conversations with General Nansen, the commandant, and in fact, I would recommend to the participants to read his book, Stand Up Straight. It's a really good book about how one can be resilient, how one can lead, and the ethos of the army. So one thing that struck me is that you have a very defined culture. How do you in the army develop that culture? I mean, you did not seem to be as hierarchical as people on the outside would think. You seem to have a very agile structure of leadership, which is very flexible. But how do you sort of develop the trust generally? I mean, you mentioned that you work as a close-knit team. You have well-formed, regular teams as against the flexible teams we find ourselves in. But how is that sort of culture maintained where you develop trust and psychological safety? How do you ensure that culture of psychological safety? Because mistakes happen in warfare as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the example of the close-knit teams and the cohesion is certainly what the army aims for, but it tends to be the model of what you would regard as war fighting battalions, infantry battalions. You know, soldiers stay in those units for a long time, and they have a history and a tradition and uniform and badges. And, you know, the army could, you know, puts the scouts to shame with the amount of badges that we can have for various things. But those are all symbols of belonging and symbols of being part of a club and being part of a tribe. So whilst I would say the army is generally good at cohesion, actually it's good at cohesion at certain levels, but the better cohesion you've got in one pool actually can be counterproductive in another. You know, two infantry battalions from two different places will happily go to war with each other because their cohesion as a unit is so strong that it almost makes them tribal against another unit. You know, don't let them both out in Aldershot on the same night, woe betide. But I think the reason that we are able to have quite an agile structure is because we wear those badges of rank so visibly. You know, and I often hear people saying, well, the NHS has got a flat, you know, or has got a flattening hierarchy. And of course, there is no difference in, you know, who's in charge. There's no, you know, the surgeon isn't in charge. Well, actually, somebody does have to be in charge. And because we wear our ranks so visibly, that is oddly freeing. That allows you to be very, very humble in the way that you deal with your, you know, subordinates several ranks down. You know, it's a different field, but, you know, even as a logistician, my private soldiers knew things that I didn't know as a lieutenant colonel. Now, it's different in the clinical world, I get it, you know, but there was no shame as a senior officer in me asking a private soldier for advice. And that's where Sally's comment on the floor washing struck with me. Because everybody is valued. And the motto of Sandhurst is serve to lead. It is about, you know, putting yourself behind the others and, you know, freeing your soldiers to be the people who are at the forefront of reward, at the forefront of accolades. So we are lots of different cultures. I think we build it through the values and standards. And if there's a consistent umbrella across the army, it's on the values. And I know Langley touched on those last week. The values are so enforced that they are actually our management performance tool. They are our discipline tool. If somebody, it's rare in the army to actually have to do formal discipline, but whenever I've ever had to do it, it always opens with, how do you, the accused, measure yourself against these values? So I guess that would be my piece of advice in terms of building the culture, is that you all have to be on the same vision, and that vision is your organization's values. And sorry, I'll leave it there. I'm starting to waffle.
No, it's very insightful. Very, very insightful. Thank you so much. I think we're coming to the end now. Just before I hand over, we really want to, I'm sure lots of you have come back week after week to these series. We really, really want to ask anyone who has a spare moment just to give us some time just to get some feedback about our sessions. We continuously looking at ways to up what we're doing and add more value to those who are listening. So I'd be grateful if you give us feedback about the session so far, but also if anyone has extra time after this meeting, just 5 minutes just to give us some proper feedback about the sessions and what you guys, what you all want to see and how we can make it more valuable to yourselves. So I'll hand over to...
Ali is going to close. Yeah.
Is it Ali?
Yes. So I thought today's session was very illuminating. We got lots of people contributing, discussing about the culture of the NHS. And many of you would agree that the culture is actually created by an organization, represented, for example, by the military. It's created by the leader. The leader exemplifies the values of society. Now, I have to say that Stephen Morris mentioned New Zealand as an example, and I suppose the way New Zealand has conducted itself in the past year in relation to whether it was the mass killings in the mosque or whether it was the response to COVID-19, it is the leader that has actually shone and established, if you like, that particular culture. So it is really for the leader to develop that culture of trust, that culture of investment. A lot is said in the NHS. These themes are repeated again and again in organizational development meetings. And yet, you know, we still find people like yourselves coming forward and talking about a lack of trust in different aspects of things that happen in the NHS, whether it's appraisal, whether it's conduct on the surgical floor, and other things. So the question there is why? Why is that the case? It's fear, is what some people have said. It's psychological fear, psychological safety. Then somebody also mentioned trial by media. Yes, of course. We live in that age of social media. We live in the age, before that, we lived in the age of Fleet Street and the electronic media. And there's that fear that people could be left exposed. Now, interestingly, on that note, I'd like to say that in a couple of weeks, we've got a speaker who has an organization called Learning for Excellence, and his name is Adrian Plunkett, and he'll be talking to us about how you learn, not just from mistakes, which has become, if you like, the norm since the Bristol tragedy over 20 years ago. Clinical governance has been set about learning from mistakes, but Adrian Plunkett makes a very coherent and vociferous case for learning from how good things went, about celebrating that. And you can often see that in the sports field, where a Formula One driver, for example, might have crashed once or twice, but he's not defined by that. He's defined by the number of races he's won. A tennis player is defined by the number of matches they have won, not by the number of matches they have lost. So I think we can continue these sessions on how to define the culture in which we want to work, about the successes to celebrate rather than the mistakes we have made. It is important to learn from mistakes, otherwise they won't be success. So I'd like to, at this point, thank you all for being with us and contributing so well. Please do join us next week to be with Barbara Kemp, who is going to be talking about conflict. Now that is also a very difficult area. One person cannot resolve that. You need more, you need a culture as well that is established where there should not be conflict, but if there's conflict, it's constructive conflict from which people learn, but destructive conflict to be avoided at all times. It is coming to a point, I suppose, 8 weeks of lockdown, people are starting to wear out. I think the sun's out and I'd like to, let go. I wish you the very best of health, and keep safe, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Gill. Thank you, everyone, for joining in.